Welcome to the Plant-Free MD podcast with Dr. Anthony Chafee, where we discuss diet and nutrition and how this affects health and chronic disease, and show you how you can use this to optimize your health and happiness, both mentally and physically. Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining me on another episode of the Plant-Free MD podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Chafee, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Chris Knobbe, who is an ophthalmologist and a nutritional researcher, has published many studies on the field of nutrition and how food affects chronic disease and health, and has just published a recent book called The Ancestral Diet Revolution. Dr. Knobbe, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure for having you here.
Oh, thanks, Anthony. I appreciate you having me on. It's my pleasure.
Not a problem. So for those who haven't come across...
You can't call me doctor, though.
What's that?
You can't call me doctor, though.
Okay, all right.
I don't let anybody call me doctor, let alone other doctors.
Yeah, all right. So, Chris, thank you very much for coming on. For people who haven't come across your talks on YouTube or your work, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a physician trained in an allopathic medical school, the University of Colorado School of Medicine. I graduated 33 years ago. I eventually specialized in ophthalmology, and I spent about 24 years all total in ophthalmology practice, and actually left practice to pursue nutrition research back in February of 2015. But I really got into nutrition. I'll just make this brief because if anybody's ever heard me before, they'll be sick of hearing this. But I really got into nutrition born out of my own suffering, which for me was primarily arthritis, and a change towards a paleo diet for me back in 2011 drastically improved my arthritis in just a matter of a week to 10 days. And this was just life-changing for me, Anthony. And it sent me down a path of trying to learn about nutrition, and eventually came across the work of Weston A. Price in 2013. And then I began to understand that, all processed foods, refined flour, sugars, vegetable oils, all that were driving so much chronic disease. And then I applied that, basically I theorized that, or hypothesized that the same processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration, AMD, the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 now worldwide. And so I researched that for about a year and a half while I was still in practice. And in February of 2015, I was so convinced that theory, that hypothesis held water, that I left practice and pursued that full time. And within a small group, we evaluated sugar and vegetable oil consumption data, which is basically tracking processed food. But we evaluated those components in 25 nations, and every single nation, the data supported the hypothesis that as the processed foods went up, especially the vegetable oils, that the macular degeneration went up, the macular degeneration prevalence went up, precisely in correlation. And so we published a paper on that in 2017. I published a book, started a nonprofit foundation, but by 2018 and 2019, I just was seeing, Anthony, that there was so much evidence about the vegetable oils driving obesity and heart disease, cancers and diabetes and chronic disease, and I just felt like it wasn't being covered that well. And so that's kind of when I went public with that as well, which is in 2019, and began to present on that and talk more about vegetable oils and the big picture of all of this chronic disease. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of where my life has been focused in the last 4 or 5 years, really, is mostly about vegetable oils and chronic disease.
Yeah. And then your book is sort of masterclass on that, and talking about all the different sorts of ways that vegetable oils can impact our health. And in fact, how, they might be the major driver in these so-called chronic diseases, which, I fully agree. I don't think they're diseases at all. I think this is the exposure relationship. We're clearly eating something, exposing ourselves to something that is not natural, is not supposed to be there, and our bodies are responding in some sort of deranged manner, and we're calling them these various diseases and just saying, oh, it's just one of those things. But if it was just one of those things, then it wouldn't, continue to increase in prevalence decade after decade after decade. So obviously there's something going on, and we're getting more and more exposed to this. So in that book, you talk about all the different strong indicators and correlations between seed oils and various diseases, obesity, diabetes, and so on. Can you take us through a bit of that? And I believe you have a slide presentation as well, if you wanted to go into that as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me just say, if we look at the big picture first, that through all of history, up through the middle of the 19th century, there was precious little vegetable oils in the food supply for any population. These are tiny amounts of coconut oil, palm oil, sesame oil. These are very small amounts, and olive oil, all going back thousands of years. But the enormous majority of the world, I would estimate over 95% through up through the end of the American Civil War, 1865, had never, ever had a vegetable oil of any type. They'd never consumed it. And I worked really hard to look at that evidence, historically. And so that's the conclusion. And we're just about to publish a paper on this that will include this information. And so basically, in the United States, cottonseed oil was the first vegetable oil. In fact, if you would have used the term vegetable oil in 1865, most anywhere in the world, no one would have known what you're talking about. They never heard that term, because there isn't such a thing, really. To this day, there isn't really a vegetable oil. I mean, they don't come from vegetables, right? But cottonseed oil was introduced right after the American Civil War, so 1866 essentially. And then in 1909 we got soybean oil, and then we got all the others. So we've got soybean. Today we've got soybean of the. Let me back up and restate this. So of the highly polyunsaturated seed oils, which are the most dangerous. So this is my list of the worst, would be soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame, and peanut oils. And these oils are all very high in omega-6. And so if you looked at Americans, just to give you the data, in 1865, we had almost precisely zero vegetable oil consumption. All we would have had was just trivial amounts of olive oil. And I mean trivial, like a tiny fraction of a gram per person per day in this nation, in the United States. And by 1909, we were up to about 9 grams a day. We look at some of this data. And then by 1961, we're at 19 and a half grams a day. And by 2010, 80 grams of vegetable oil per day. And so when I began looking at this, well, I first, even before I had that data, was looking at the evidence of the prevalence of chronic diseases in the 19th century, for example, and they're all virtually rare or they don't exist. So coronary heart disease, an extreme medical rarity, Alzheimer's, dementia, unknown, completely unknown, age-related macular degeneration. There were no cases in the United States that I know of. There was a handful of cases around the world in the 19th century. Again, Alzheimer's wasn't diagnosed until 1908. Obesity in the United States in the 19th century is the only place in the world where I know we have really, pretty good data. And obesity in the United States in men age 18 to 80 was 1.2%. And of course now all of these things, in the United States, well, in the world, Coronary heart disease is the leading cause of death. Cancer is the second leading cause of death. It's the same in the United States. Obesity went from 1.2% in the 19th century to 42.5% in 2018 in the United States. And this is, again, just with sticking with the big picture here is all of these things have tracked with vegetable oils. Now they track with processed foods, but the major component of processed foods is vegetable oils, and they're high in omega-6. And why is that problematic? Well, because the omega-6s accumulate in our body fat, and this sets up a pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient biological milieu that is the perfect storm, really, to create obesity and chronic disease.
Hey guys, just want to take a second to thank our sponsor at Carnivore Bar. I don't promote many products because honestly, all you need to be healthy is to just eat meat. For those times that you're out hiking, road tripping, or stuck at work and you want a nutritious snack that is just meat, fat, and salt if you want it, the Carnivore Bar is a great option. So I like this product not because it's just pure meat, but also because I want the carnivore market to thrive as well. And the more we support meat-only products, the more meat-only products there will be available in the mainstream. So if this sounds like something you'd like to get behind, check it out using my discount code Anthony to get 10% off, which also applies to subscriptions, giving you 25% off total. All right. Thanks, guys. Yeah. And we were sort of talking about that, before we came on here, but, there are those who argue that all of these diseases were happening anyway. We just didn't notice them because anyone born before 1986 is an idiot and obviously can't see what's in front of them. But of course they did keep quite good statistics, from the studies that you've published and the data. It's actually quite robust, isn't it? What were people looking at? What were some of the disease rates in the 1800s? What you said that really heart disease really wasn't wasn't described until the early 1900s at all. And I think I remember you seeing. Sorry, go on.
Well, it was, Anthony, but it was rare. So, like in the 19th century, there's 8 papers on coronary heart disease for the entire century. 8. And 2 of those were on thrombotic coronary heart disease, which would be the equivalent of myocardial infarction, right? It's heart attack. So 8. I don't really know what the number of papers is. There's probably been 8 papers published on coronary heart disease yesterday. Yeah. Right. I don't know how many, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of papers would relate to coronary heart disease. Like it would just be staggering, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, you could fill train loads full of papers that are related to coronary heart disease today, right? And but why? Because it was so incredibly rare. The most famous physician, perhaps in the world, but at least in the United States, was Sir William Osler. He published these, famous medical textbooks, Principles and Practice of Medicine. His first textbook came out in 1893, and he made it very clear he'd never witnessed a heart attack. He witnessed about 6 cases of angina, chest pain that might be related to coronary heart disease, He'd noticed about 6 cases in the previous 21 years of his practice. He said it was a very rare disease in hospitals, angina. And then in 1908, I believe it was, he gave a presentation in London, England, to other physicians, and he had noticed an additional 208 cases of angina between 1897 and 1908. And he related that potentially to the increasing stresses of modern life, is what he said. And what he didn't realize was the thing that was going up was the vegetable oils. That's the thing that had been introduced in the United States in 1866. And at the, shortly later in the United Kingdom. And then from those two, some of Europe was getting vegetable oils that were coming from, ultimately, most of it coming from the US. But anyway, that's what was going up. First the first documented heart attack in the United States was in 1912. James Herrick, physician, published a paper, first documented heart attack with autopsy evidence. Nobody even took it seriously. It was virtually just, swept under the rug. Nobody cared at all because nobody knew what it was. They weren't aware of such a thing as a heart attack, a myocardial infarction. And so it was about almost 10 years went by before there was any recognition that the paper was of any interest. And it was because they were starting to see some other heart attacks in the 1920s. And it's just astoundingly, by the 1930s, coronary heart disease became the leading cause of death in the United States. I mean, I think it was only responsible for 8 or 10% of the deaths. If it was even that, I'm not sure. I really don't know that number, Anthony, but so I shouldn't spit that out. But it was the leading cause of death. But yet in 1910, coronary heart disease was unknown, completely unknown, 20 years earlier. And so this is what astounds me, because by the 1950s, as you know, as the story goes, and everybody's all heard this that a million times probably, that people began to vilify saturated fat for the cause of heart disease, or at least it was implicated in the 1950s. And then by the 1960s, the American Heart Association, along with Ancel Keys, had posited that saturated fat was the cause of coronary heart disease. And so, we've had, a period of at least probably 45, 50 years where people have been led to believe that it's saturated fat. But in the 20th century, saturated fat hardly changed at all. We could look at, I think I've got that data handy here, but you can see it hardly changed at all, while coronary heart disease just went from nothing in 1900 to, and remained the leading cause of death from 1930s to today. And so, but anyway, yeah. So, but it's been a really strong parallel with vegetable oils, and there's no relation to saturated fat, which has remained flat since 1900. Saturated fat between 1900 and 2010, saturated fat increased about 5 grams, so roughly a teaspoon worth of fat. Yeah. So if people would have looked at our graph, and I've got it here, if people would have looked at this graph, if you want me to share it, I could do that right now. Yeah. So let me go here. We'll share screen. Change graphs here. So if people look at this, they'll. Is that visible there, Anthony? Okay.
Yeah, I can see it fine.
Okay, so people see those who can see this graph, they'll see that the vegetable oils are in the black, and you see this increasing consumption from 1900 all the way through 2010. They never stop increasing, really. Well, I guess on this graph we don't have. It ends at 2020, so it doesn't. You can see, but where it ends in 2010 on the vegetable oil, you can see that's still on the increase. And the saturated fat in the purple is virtually, pretty much flat. But the heart disease in red, that parallels, almost precisely parallels the vegetable oil consumption. Yeah. And, some people have looked at this and they said, well, the way this graph looks, it looks like the coronary heart disease is causing the vegetable oil consumption because it's higher. But you can change the axis of we should do this really, but you can change the numbers on either axis to make those the line go up or down, but the relationship is still identical. So you can't change the relationship. So I mean, we could make the vegetable oils look like they're bigger, is my point. But this was our first graph published back in our paper relating to macular degeneration back in 2017. So I use this one.
Yeah. And and that's something too. You have heart disease deaths as well, and that just sort of dipped down. But as I understand it, that's mostly to do with our interventions improving with stenting and bypass surgery and things like that, and early flagging, seeing someone with angina and being able to treat them early and not have them, progress on to having a full-blown heart attack. But as I understand it, the rates and prevalence of heart disease is continuing to rise as well, certainly on a global scale. Is that true?
It absolutely is. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I do think that the procedures may be saving lives, but the number one reason that fewer people are dying of coronary heart disease is because smoking prevalence has gone way down. Yeah, that's the number one reason, at least in the United States and in the United Kingdom. So both had very high prevalence of smoking. In the United Kingdom, smoking prevalence was like 78%. I think it was in 1948, roughly. Those are rough numbers, but that's pretty close. So, and it was pretty high. It was pretty close to I think it was over 50% in the United States around that time.
Yeah.
So since smoking's gone way down, and that's been a big benefit in terms of coronary heart disease.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just looking at these charts, I mean, there's, like you say, there's absolutely no relationship between saturated fat and heart disease, deaths or prevalence, because you're keeping roughly the same. Saturated fat is nearly as high in, 1910 as it is now. And yet heart disease, wasn't really heard of. It was a little known thing, or actually not known in America.
Yeah, I don't know if you will agree with this, but I said before that if this graph would have been published in 1960 in a scientific paper, I don't know how anyone could have ever argued that saturated fat was the cause of heart disease.
Yeah, I
just don't know how you could make that case, because correlation is not causation, but you have to have correlation in order to prove causation.
Yeah.
Right. And you don't have correlation here between saturated fat and heart disease. There's just no relationship here.
Yeah, exactly. And even the Journal of the American College of Cardiology published, I believe in 2020, a large paper, reviewing all the different sorts of, studies and RCTs and meta-analyses on saturated fat and heart disease. And they found no link. They found absolutely no connection or correlation between saturated fat and heart disease. And in fact, they found an inverse correlation between saturated fat and stroke rates. So if anything, the data is showing that saturated fat is good for you, doesn't cause heart disease, doesn't contribute to heart disease, and in fact can protect you against stroke and potentially other diseases as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the healthiest fat there is to me is saturated fat. I mean, we require the polyunsaturated fats; they're essential fatty acids, so those are a must in terms of survival. But you can't not get them if you eat food. They're in all foods. The polyunsaturated fats, the omega-6 linoleic acid and omega-3 alpha linolenic acid. So LA and ALA respectively, and those are in all foods that are not prepared in a lab where you've extracted all of the fat. So anything you can think of that you could eat, I don't care if it's apples or oranges or white rice, whatever, is going to have fat, and it will have linoleic acid, omega-6 linoleic acid and omega-3 alpha linolenic acid. You will get your essential fatty acids. But beyond that, I'm just saying that I think that the saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, both extraordinarily healthy, and this is why I make a point in the book that if we overconsume carbohydrates and you filled up all your glycogen stores, and you need to store those carbohydrates beyond your glycogen stores, your body first and preferentially makes saturated fat and then monounsaturated fat. So that tells me that's what the body really is, might be even preferential in terms of storage and burning is saturated fat.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Go ahead, Anthony.
No, I was just gonna ask. So that's how vegetable oil relates to heart disease. What about other diseases as well? And you go into in some of your talks about obesity and the link between seed oils and obesity as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, let's hit that real quick. If I could, I'm gonna share this slide before we go into the vegetable oils versus obesity.
Sure.
Because this is we're at the 50,000 foot view here, but I want to show that, the problem is processed food, and processed food is really four things to me, four fundamental components, and it's refined flours, refined sugars, vegetable oils, and trans fat. And if you look at this graph, can you see that okay, Anthony?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can see in the year 1865, and this is also set to be published here in just hopefully in the next couple of weeks. You can see the plant and animal foods in the United States accounted for 96% of the diet. Only 4% of the diet was really processed, and that was sugar. Refined sugar. But by 2009, you can see that 63% of the American diet was ultra processed food, essentially. That's seed oils, sugars, refined grains, and trans fats. And the other 37% came from plants and animals. So we went from 96% plant and animal diet in 1865 to 37% plant and animal. And a lot of that, even that 37%, that is not really good quality ancestrally raised foods. The bulk of that is, for example, CAFO raised animals and which are concentrated animal feeding operations where they're fed great, like GMO corn and soy, and even the plants. Of course, there's problems with those too because of herbicides, pesticides, and just the fact that a lot of those are GMO, none of which existed in 1865, right? Everything in the 19th century and early 20th century was all entirely ancestrally raised, and all of the plants even would have been organic, right? So I just want to hit that real quick, but we'll move on here too. So you'd ask about obesity and vegetable oil. So I'll just show this first. Let me pause this just for a second, and we'll look at obesity in the United States. So here we go. So this is what I think a lot of people don't recognize is that obesity, as I mentioned earlier already, was 1.2% in the United States in the 19th century, back at 1900. That was Scott Allen Carson's work. That was men age 18 to 80. So there was no data on women, but men age 18 to 80, 1.2% obesity. And then there's no more data until 1960 when obesity was 13.4% in the US. But the point of this is that a lot of people have looked at diet versus obesity, and they said, well, all the problems started in 1980 when we were told to go low fat, right? Saturated fat's the problem, and then it became fat's the problem. We need to go low fat, and that's what we were admonished to do by our own government, and so then obesity really took off, which it did. But what I want to show here is that just between 1900 and 1960, obesity had risen 11-fold, went from 1.2% to 13.4%. So the problem was in place essentially, and then it's just skyrocketed ever since. So let's look at we'll move forward here, and we can look at the relationship between obesity and vegetable oils. And for those who can see this graph, you can see that there's this striking correlation between obesity and vegetable oil consumption, all the way from the 1900s all the way through the end of this graph, where obesity is 42.5% in 2018, when our vegetable oil consumption by 2010 was 80 grams a day. And if I work backwards here, in 1900, it was about 1 gram a day. And then in 1961, vegetable oil consumption was 19.5 grams a day. And again, by 2010, it was 80 grams a day, right? So, and by the way, Americans consume more vegetable oil per capita than any nation in the world. And so, well, we can throw in the sugar here. So here's the graph on sugar, along with vegetable oils. And you can see that the sugar consumption was already by 1890, sugar consumption was, got the data here. Now I'm going to read this because that's not on the slide, but I've got data handy here on this, that in 1890, sugar consumption was 211 calories per day. That was already 10.8% of calories. And by 1935, sugar consumption was 440 calories a day, which is 22.5% of US caloric intake. But look, obesity was around maybe 3 to 4% at that time. And we know that diabetes in 1935 was 0.37%. We can come back to that. We know that, everything was, coronary heart disease had become the leading cause of death, but almost everything else, obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome was virtually unknown. Alzheimer's was still very rare at that point. Macular degeneration was just coming on the radar. It had been an extraordinary rarity through 1930. But anyway, you can see that there's this striking correlation between obesity and vegetable oils, but very little relationship between sugar and obesity. In fact, in 1935, as I mentioned, sugar was 440 calories, 22.5% of US caloric intake. But by 2016, sugar was was 526 calories, and that's 24% of US caloric intake. So between 1935 and 2016, sugar consumption as a percentage of the diet went up 1.5%. And as an absolute number, it went up 86 calories. And yet we've had this explosion of, obesity probably went from 3 to 4% in 1935 to 42.5% in 2018, right? And so there's just almost no correlation here with sugar. And as we could see later, even a negative correlation. So we go to this graph. Let's see. No, this is not really the one. Let's see. Here, we'll go to this one. So this one, you can see that very recently, this is just between 1999 and 2018, that sugar has been on the downward trend since at least 2004. Sugar's been going down. It's by some data, 1999, but at least by 2004, sugar has been on the decline. But between 1999 and 2018, obesity climbed from 30.5% to 42.5%. So while the sugar is going down, the obesity is going up. And but what's it going up in correlation with? And it's the vegetable oils. Yeah. And you can see this is severe obesity. Same time frame between 1999 and 2018. Severe obesity was 4.7% in 1999, 9.2% in 2018. But again, while the sugar's on the decline.
Would that include high fructose corn syrup or just?
Yes. Oh, I'm glad you asked. Yeah. So the sugars, this is all sugar. And this is the same date. We use the exact same definition that the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, would use, and the same that the World Health Organization would use, which is table sugar, cane sugar, beet sugar, corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, maple syrup, sugar sweetened beverages, and honey. So it's every form of added sugar there is, right? So when people look at this, they say, well, he didn't leave, he didn't put, for some reason, people think that I'm trying to defend sugar here.
Yeah.
And that's not my point. I've been saying since 2016, everything I've written and everything I've ever said since I started going public with this, I've always said the problem is processed food, and that's sugar, refined flours, vegetable oils, and trans fats. Sugar is part of the problem. It's a nutrient deficient food, but this data is data. And the data shows here and in multiple other countries that as sugar is going down, the obesity and the diabetes and the metabolic syndrome is going through the roof, even worse. Mm-hmm. And, so you need to account for that. So I'm not trying to defend sugar. It's part of the problem, but I'm just trying to look at the whole picture here. Yeah. For those people who think it's all, just about carbohydrates, this is data showing in the United States showing that carbohydrates since 1997 through 2013 declined in the United States. But during that same time frame, from about 1997 through 2013, obesity climbed from about 29% to about 38%. So sugar's been going down, carbohydrates have been going down, and I don't have the graph here handy, but we've also seen since 2002 in the US, the calories are going down while obesity and diabetes go through the roof.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. And so show this one. This is, let me reframe this a little bit, Anthony. So this shows sugar and vegetable oil consumption versus diabetes going all the way back into the 19th century. And again, you can see here that I'm just going to point out, so diabetes was 0.0028%. That's 2.8 per 100,000 people. That is in 1890. That was reported by Sir William Osler in his first textbook of 1893. He quoted the census. And so that equates to about 1,700 some people in the entire United States. And the population was, I think, 63 million that had diabetes in 1890. And yet, remember, in 1890, sugar consumption was already 10.8% of the calories, right? And if it's 10.8% on average, a lot of people are consuming twice that much, right? Because a lot are consuming none, and a lot are consuming twice as much. And yet diabetes was just extraordinarily rare, because if I jump all the way forward to the end of this graph, diabetes in 2016, I believe it was 13% in the US. Well, just so I give you the number, that's an increase from 1890 of 4,643 fold.
Jesus.
That it's increased. But the important thing to recognize here again is that if we look at 1935, I keep using that number because that's when sugar consumption was 440 calories, 22.5% of US caloric intake. And look what the diabetes prevalence was, 0.37%. So between 1935 and 2016, diabetes prevalence went up from 0.37% to 13%, but the sugar went up an absolute number of 1.5%, or again, 86 calories. So are you going to tell me 5 teaspoons of sugar is all the problem with the obesity, with the diabetes, with metabolic syndrome, with Alzheimer's, with dementia, macular degeneration, you name it? Are we going to blame it on 1.5% of our diet increasing in terms of sugar and a total of 86 calories? Or was it the fact that, now let me give you this number. So, because I haven't done this yet, but the vegetable oil consumption in 1935 was 146 calories. That was 7.5% of our consumption, of our total caloric consumption. All right. But by 2016, vegetable oil consumption was 716 calories per day, 29% of caloric consumption. So while sugar went up during that period, 1935 to 2016, went up 1.5% as an absolute number of our total calories, vegetable oil consumption went up 21.5%. In other words, vegetable oil consumption in that time frame takes up more than an additional fifth of every plate of food that it didn't take up in 1935.
Wow.
That is staggering. Again, vegetable oil consumption today is 32% of U.S. caloric intake before losses. I know these are lots of numbers, but that's almost a third of our calories. Amazing. Now, if you count for losses, probably the lowest we're consuming is 24%. So we're consuming somewhere between a fourth and a third of our diet I'm going to stop this, share or pause that. But anyway, a fourth to a third of our diet is vegetable oils. And this is another way to think about this, Anthony. So in 1900, 99% of all added fats came from animal fat, lard, butter, and beef tallow. But by 2005, 86% of all added fats came from vegetable oils. So the vegetable oils have almost completely supplanted and replaced animal fats in terms of our added fat in our diet. And that, to me, this is by far and away the primary problem in all of this, this pandemic of obesity and chronic disease.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think the great thing is too, that I'm just sort of using my imagination and putting my own graph, adding on to this, is that you can't blame it on meat and saturated fat anyway. We know saturated fat has stayed pretty consistent. And in fact, we've dropped our red meat consumption in America by over 1/3 since the 1970s until today. So, and during that time, you have this exponential growth in diabetes and other sorts of disease prevalences, and they're blaming this on meat. They're saying go more plant-based, go more everything, which is, I think, as long as people are getting away from processed foods, I mean, I don't really care what they eat, but it's blaming meat and things like that when that has clearly gone down, and just like sugar and everything else is coming up. It's very hard for people to argue that when they actually look at the data, but for some reason they keep doing it.
You mean, so are you still seeing lots of people blaming meat?
Oh yeah, trying to.
Okay, yeah. Let's defend meat here for a second.
Yeah,
if that's okay with you.
Yeah. Oh, please do.
Okay, this is here's a graph on U.S. total meat consumption between 1800 and 2007, and this comes from all published data. And so this is in our new book, The Ancestral Diet Revolution, and you can see that this is for those who can see it. Their total meat consumption I think
it doesn't look like it's changed on this screen.
I'm sorry.
Oh, there we go.
Are we on now?
Yeah. U.S. total meat consumption.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. All right. So total meat consumption back around 1800s, probably around 220 pounds per person per day. So these are, I'm sorry, this was converted to grams per capita per day on this one. But anyway, it's whatever that is, 200 and some grams per day. But the important thing is to notice that the meat consumption was, in the 19th century, 1800 to 1900, you can see was actually declining. But again, that entire century is where coronary heart disease was unknown, right? And in 1912, as meat consumption begins to hit, it's close to its nadir, the lowest point is when the first documented heart attack was 1912. And then you can see in the 1930s is right about the same time that meat consumption hit its nadir in the last 200 years. Its lowest point of consumption is when coronary heart disease became the leading cause of death, and then meat consumption went back up. So you can see it's a U-shaped curve. So now we're back up to meat consumption that's about as high or a little higher than it was in 1800. Mm-hmm. But coronary heart disease has, as I've mentioned already twice before, has been the leading cause of death in the U.S. since the 1930s, right? In fact, it increased a lot but again, in parallel to the meat, to the vegetable oil consumption. So again, you have absolutely no correlation here between meat consumption and heart disease. Again, that would absolutely make no sense whatsoever when we had very high meat consumption in the 19th century and early 19th century especially, and coronary heart disease unknown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's completely unrelated. Yeah. And well, that's fantastic. It's, when you look at these sorts of data points, I think it's very clear, there isn't a relationship there. There's not a correlation, but people have just been pushing this for so many years. I think they're just so used to it, and they just sort of keep driving, try to drive those points home. And because people haven't been exposed to the data as much, just the lay people, but they just don't know. They just repeat this. We all know, meat's bad for you, fat's bad for you. So they just sort of keep repeating that. And I think it's very important to show data like this and show that this has absolutely nothing to do with it, and then show, okay, what is the more likely culprit here? Ultra processed foods, clearly, that's directly related to these diseases increasing. One thing I've seen you speak about as well is the damage that these seed oils cause to the mitochondria, and that's something that is becoming more and more obvious now, is that a lot of these chronic diseases are driven by mitochondrial damage and disruption. So could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me talk about how we get there first, and then the mitochondrial damage. And I might show a slide here. So I'm going to show two slides to try to answer this. Okay. The first is that I'm going to show you that the seed oil consumption is dangerous because it's very high in omega-6. And so for comparison, the seed oils that I mentioned, like from canola oil all the way up to, which is around 20% omega-6 linoleic acid. And then you've got soybean oil at 54 to 56% omega-6 linoleic acid. And then safflower oil, I think, is around 78%. So that's kind of the gamut, of all those, that's where those oils run. Mm-hmm. And if you contrast that to naturally raised animals, in other words, animals, again, not fed corn and soy, and we can get into the details of that, but those animals, beef, cattle, even chicken and pigs, they all will produce a body fat omega-6 LA of around 2 to 2.5% if they're fed the right thing. All right. And so that's what the whole world was consuming until we, for added fats primarily. The only other thing they had for almost all of history through the 19th century was olive oil. And olive oil averages around 10% omega-6 linoleic acid, but it runs a gamut from about 3% to about 22%. And so I'm trying to give people a perspective here that the vegetable oils, when you put those in your diet in place of anything else, you're increasing your omega-6 consumption. And that omega-6, I'm going to share that here, is we've shown this to have increased dramatically, around 11-fold since 1865. So this graph shows, and is that showing for you, Anthony?
Yep.
Okay. So this graph shows that we modeled the diets of Americans in 1865, and what they were consumed based on a completely ancestral diet and everything they were consuming, beef, pork, chicken. They didn't consume a lot of chicken. It's very small in that, but chicken, eggs, dairy, milk, cheese, and then it was very high in grains and potatoes, all that. Anyway, the consumption of omega-6 is about 2.2 to 2.6 grams a day. So it averages about 2.4 grams, 1.1% of calories. You can see by 1909, we're at 2.23% of our calories as omega-6. By 1999, 7.21% of our calories as omega-6. In 2008, 11.8%, or 29 grams a day. So we went from about 2.4 grams of omega-6 in 1865 to 29 grams in 2008. So we went from 1.1% of calories to 11.8%. Roughly, it's an 11-fold increase in our omega-6 consumption. And so, well, what does that do to us? Well, it turns out that, let me reframe this graph here, that we accumulate the omega-6s in our body fat. And this is a graph from Stefan Guillenet. This shows the percent of linoleic acid in our adipose, our body fat. And this was a collation of 37 or 38 studies between 1959 and 2008. And you can see that our body fat, omega-6 linoleic acid, was averaged 9.1% in 1959 and 21.5% in 2008. So again, this precisely parallels the increase in the vegetable oils. So we're accumulating these in our body fat. And as I mentioned early on, this sets up a pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient environment. But you'd ask about mitochondrial dysfunction and seed oils. And there's a number of ways that processed foods and vegetable oils get us there. But the primary way, I believe, is that when you accumulate omega-6 in your body and in your body fat, that also means it's accumulating in all of your cell membranes and in your inner mitochondrial membranes. And there's a couple of different mechanisms here, but I'll just mention one of these is that when the omega-6 accumulates in the inner mitochondrial membrane, it causes changes to the conformation of that membrane that results in pores. And those pores allow hydrogen protons that are supposed to be built up as a gradient inside that inner mitochondrial membrane. And it allows those hydrogen protons to leak through that membrane. Well, those hydrogen protons are meant to provide the energy to phosphorylate ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to ATP, adenosine triphosphate. ATP is the energy currency of the cell, and we lose that. We lose that power with this high omega-6 diet, and this has all been proven. So when you lose power, then all of a sudden, I mean, this is the electron transport chain we're talking about. This is the major place where our energy production occurs. And so when the cell loses energy like this, I just tell people, the cell is sick. And when the cell becomes sick, well, the first thing that happens is increased reactive oxygen species, which actually feeds the cycle. And then the next step is that the cell becomes insulin resistant. And the cell becomes insulin resistant because it can no longer properly process food for fuel. And it can no longer, you can't properly burn fat for fuel any longer because you've devastated the electron transport chain. And so this is where I believe that now the cell just begins to store energy in the form of lipid. And a lot of that lipid is this omega-6, right? And so, but the cell cannot properly burn fat for fuel. And I think this is why we see, this part of the reason that we see extreme morbid obesity is in people that don't even eat a lot of food. Some of these people, I believe, Anthony, eat less than you and I do. And they become extraordinarily obese because they don't have good energy, but they have a fat partitioning because they can't properly burn fat for fuel any longer when they've devastated the mitochondrial function. So you get mitochondrial dysfunction, and again, that leads to insulin resistance. And at the cellular level, and the cell is a microcosm of the entire body, so the whole body essentially becomes insulin resistant. And as that process goes on, then your blood sugars tend to go up, and eventually, and your pancreas then is pumping out more insulin to try to push the glucose into cells, but the cells are insulin resistant. So you have this fight. And, so eventually, if this goes on for years and years, the pancreas may sort of start giving up. It can't put out enough insulin any longer. And that's when people become diabetic.
Yeah.
But I hope I, kind of answered what you were trying to get at. And I hope that made sense.
Yeah, definitely. So do you think that's maybe one of the major drivers of disease then, is that mitochondrial dysfunction, or what do you think is the main process here?
Yes, I do. I think mitochondrial dysfunction is what connects all chronic diseases virtually. Mm-hmm. Everything from, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, or anybody can, and I may be here, but because I can't remember all the list, but I know that mitochondrial dysfunction is important in obesity, in diabetes, in metabolic syndrome, in congestive heart failure. We see it related to atherosclerosis. You see it in age-related macular degeneration, AMD. You see it in Alzheimer's and dementia. I don't know what I'm leaving. Cancer, huge in cancer. So why are all these diseases connected by mitochondrial dysfunction? And why are they all? Are they all characterized by insulin resistance? And it's because of this precise scenario that I just painted. That the primary mechanism, I believe, again, is it's processed food driving all of this, but the primary problem is the omega-6. And then the rest of the processed food makes this worse because, there's other situations that can drive insulin resistance. If you're magnesium deficient, that drives insulin resistance. Thiamine, vitamin B1 deficiency, can make you insulin resistant. Inflammation, which is caused by processed food, drives insulin resistance. Cortisol going up, which maybe you could argue is an effect, but cortisol going up is related to insulin resistance. And, of course, there's other things, lack of sleep and stress and all that plays a role. But, we've got to get to what are the huge factors? And what we obviously see is, people have always had, people in the 19th century had stress, and I guarantee you they had, lack of sleep, they're overworked, all those kind of things. But they didn't have all these diseases. Hmm. The thing that's changed is the diet, and it's the vegetable oils again that are by far and away the biggest driver here, in my view. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I think you've made a very strong case for that, and I think that people watching this, just more ammo in the bank. Like your last chart showed, actually eating quite a lot of meat early on in the early 1800s, and these diseases did not exist, just did not exist.
Yeah. Right.
Eating fat, eating saturated fat, eating a level amount of saturated fat throughout the 20th century, and again, not related to any of these sorts of diseases as well. And I think that the title of your book is very, very apt, because it goes back to our biology. If we're eating what we've been eating throughout our entire existence, what we're biologically adapted and designed to eat, then we should just be working fine. And we had these while we were doing that, we did not have these diseases in nearly the prevalence that we have now, whereas now they're the mainstay of modern medicine. And whereas they didn't even exist 150 years ago in any real numbers to any degree. And so it can't be that. It can't be what we've been eating historically that's causing that. As one person put it years ago, how can an ancient diet cause a new disease? Right. So I think
exactly.
Yeah, at new additions. As to that, what do you conclude is the best diet appropriate, the ancestrally based diet? What do you recommend for people?
Well, I spend a lot of my my research and even in my presentations, I've tried to paint a number of different diets that are all ancestral because, and I don't recommend any one of those diets necessarily, broadly. Because obviously Americans are going to eat different than the Japanese, and the Japanese are going to eat different than the Greek, and so on, right? And so I try to focus on the fact that we all have an ancestral diet that may be more appropriate to us, that we just, if nothing else, we just like it better. And that could be, for example, as I just mentioned, in the 19th century for Americans, we consumed, we were probably the second most carnivorous population on the planet. The number one most carnivorous population would have been the Inuit, what people would back then would have called Eskimos, but the Inuit, right? Because their diet was almost exclusively meat for around 11 months of the year, because they were living off of seal meat and blubber, whale meat and blubber, caribou, reindeer, fish, and then they'd get tiny amounts of berries, and they would sometimes eat the contents of some of the caribou and reindeer that they had killed. So they'd get tiny amounts of fruit or vegetable matter throughout the year, but yet they were very healthy. This was shown by Bielema or Stephenson. Like, for example, they just had no cancer, at all. Couldn't find it in the Eskimos that were living traditionally. But if we look at, but 19th century Americans consumed lots of, besides their meat, their milk, their eggs, they consumed, in 1909, 37% of the diet was grains. And this is when we were fantastically healthy, right? Yeah. Now, you can argue all about the grains, all you want to, but the reality is the grains that they had, which were all organic, and you could argue that they're artisan-like, or what, they were unchanged in terms of the all of the hybridization and so forth. All of those things are true. But the reality is that they were consuming a lot of wheat, corn, and some rice. Anyway, but again, 37%. That comes from Tanya Blasbog's research. Again, that was Americans' ancestral diet, and they did not have chronic disease, and they didn't have obesity with that kind of diet. And of course, that wouldn't apply to, like, the Japanese, for example. Their diet for hundreds of years on mainland Japan has mostly been white rice and fish with small amounts of vegetables. And the Okinawans, their diet for the last 4 centuries has been based primarily on the sweet potato, which was more than 80% of their consumption. And so they didn't have fish primarily. They mostly consumed pork. So their diet was more than 80% sweet potatoes, with pork and vegetables being the remainder. And yet we all know the Japanese and the Okinawans, which is a subset of the Japanese, they're one of the healthiest populations that's, at least in terms of developed nations. They were probably the healthiest population with the longest survival of any population there has been, right? And they had that when their diet was more than 80% carbohydrate, coming from either white rice. It was 84% carbohydrate in 1961. And that was white rice on mainland Japan. And it was traditionally sweet potatoes for the Okinawans, but they gradually, after 1950, after World War II and American occupation, the sweet potatoes in the Okinawans were gradually supplanted by other things. And so their sweet potato consumption has gone way down, but it was their primary staple for, like I said, for about three to 4 centuries, probably 4 centuries, we have the evidence that that's what they lived off of primarily. And so anyway, I just look at all of these different populations. And so whether it's, 80, 90% carbohydrate, and there's another population I've talked about before, the Papua New Guineans of Tucacenta that were more than 90% carbohydrate, and they were actually a very healthy population. Or whether it's 66% animal fat, like the Maasai warriors of Kenya and Tanzania, who were also extremely healthy. These are the polar opposites, really, if you will. And yet they're all healthy. This is why I argue it's not about macronutrient ratios. It just cannot possibly be about macronutrient ratios. And I don't argue for any level of macronutrient ratio for anyone. I think that's a very individual, and maybe even a bio-individual decision, based on people's own desires and their own body and maybe their own heritage or social, customs, whatever, their culture. I think there's a lot of reasons, that we have to respect all of these kinds of diets. But they all, when they're healthy, they all eliminate the same things. They always eliminate the processed foods.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the Inuit as an example, because they are quite healthy, and there's some people try to knock them because they'll say that, well, maybe they're not all that healthy and their heart disease rates are actually bad. In fact, they're not. Obviously, Dr. Stefansson found that they were extraordinarily healthy, and in fact, most of the literature shows that they're very, very healthy, have very, very low rates of heart disease when they are eating a traditional, meal.
Right.
And then you get people that find these studies that don't separate out the two, and they have people that are living in the cities, eating the traditional processed food, drinking alcohol and things like that. And they're like, oh, well, actually, there is this prevalence of heart disease in that population. But that's obviously misleading, or it's intentionally misleading, because you're not talking about the diet. You're not talking about these people that are eating a carnivorous diet, high fat diet. You're including people that are eating exactly the opposite, and that's the whole point. We're not talking about them as a genetic subspecies, subclass, right? We're talking about the diet. And what I think is very interesting about that is because there are a lot of studies that I've seen that look at the Inuit population and have quite low prevalence of heart disease. Even some of these things are mixed too. Maybe they're not just purely eating meat, but just overall would be quite good. And they start smoking on average at 8 years old. So there's a high smoking rate in
Really?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's pretty crazy.
I didn't know that.
And so I saw one study, I think it was in 1993, where they were looking at that. And like, okay, there's heavy smokers, start smoking from an early age, and they're eating a lot of saturated fat and meat. They're not really eating any of the other things that we would think would be good for them. So they posited that, well, maybe they have genetic conditions, so they're much more resistant to heart disease. So they looked at a number of different genetic factors, and that would predispose or protect people from heart disease. And they figured that they would have all the protective genetic markers, and in fact, they had all the bad ones. They had all the ones that would actually predispose them for heart disease, and that they were doing everything against what you would expect. And so they just sort of concluded, like, well, we don't know what's going on here. Maybe there's other genetic factors we don't know of, or maybe these genetic factors are really not all they're cracked up to be. And they just sort of left it at that instead of sort of wondering what else was going on. So I always find the Inuit interesting, just because you can always argue that, well, maybe these other populations were eating X, Y, and Z, but they knew it. They weren't able to. There's really, like you say, 11 months out of the year, especially up north, what else is there to eat? Like, it's meat.
Yeah, nothing else.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've read Weston A. Price's book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, but he also found the Inuit to be extremely healthy consuming their native traditional diet. So Vilhelm Stephenson, did I keep hitting my mic here? Sorry. Vilmer Stephenson, I might be pronouncing his name wrong, Anthony, but he found them extraordinarily healthy, and they just did not find cancer in those people consuming their native traditional diet, which is what Price found everywhere. Yeah, I didn't realize they smoke so much, but it's interesting because like the Pacific Islanders in general, like the Catawbans, for example, they smoke like crazy. And when Staffen Lindeberg evaluated them back in 92 or 93, the late Staffen Lindeberg, but he lived among them for a while. I think it was just really maybe just a few weeks, maybe 6 weeks or something. But they were phenomenally healthy, right? They had no coronary heart disease, no cancers, no diabetes, no obesity. And what was their diet? Their diet was much like the Tokalowans. It was coconut, fish, starchy tubers, and fruit primarily. I think that's correct. But anyway, of course, they didn't have any processed foods, and they certainly didn't have any vegetable oils. But they smoked like, I think 80% roughly, if I remember right, of the men and women. It was, I think even the women were higher than the men, if I recall. But their smoking prevalence was extremely high. They were daily smokers, and yet no heart disease, no cancer. They weren't getting lung cancer. And these populations, I don't see that they particularly ruled it out, but I also don't see that they get COPD, emphysema, right? Just even when they're smoking on their traditional diet. And Weston Price found something really similar with the populations, the Scottish who were living in the Outer Hebrides. They lived in those smoke-filled, thatched roof huts or cabins or whatever. It was cold. It's cold there, like the majority of the year, and they had no. They didn't have any chimneys, so they burned the wood or whatever, and just let the smoke billow into their house, into their home, and they didn't have tuberculosis. They weren't getting lung cancer. They weren't getting. I mean, I don't think he particularly said they don't have lung cancer, but they certainly didn't have tuberculosis. And there was no mention that they had lung cancer or emphysema, COPD. But again, their diet was mostly seafood and oats, but it protected them. Yeah. But all of these diets, I just want to mention, I've looked at all of these ancestral diets, and if you look at the omega-6 consumption, so far they're all of them I've seen that are completely ancestral, they're under 2% of calories. And Westernized diets are now between 5% at the lowest to about 12% at the highest omega-6 linoleic acid. And where does all that come from? Vegetable oils, seed oils.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. Right. And it's all just continues to go up. This is what we've seen. The United States led the way, and then the UK followed, and then in Europe, and then Australia, and just kind of spread around the world. Asia was the last to really follow this trend of increasing vegetable oil consumption, but they have too. So the Japanese, the Chinese, all of them, every single Asian nation, as far as I know, has increased their vegetable oil consumption, except but Vietnam has the among the lowest consumption in the world of their vegetable oils. And they also at least recently had the lowest obesity in the world, which was I think it was somewhere around 1% range.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, that's crazy.
It's not an accident.
No, I don't think so either. It's
yeah.
And we definitely do notice that, every time, we sort of made these trends in America, and like you say, UK followed suit, but every single country that's followed those dietary recommendations, they've just dropped like dominoes. Their disease and obesity prevalence just climbed up exactly like it has in America. And it's like clockwork. So obviously there's something going on there with what we're eating. We're moving away from what we're designed to eat. We're moving into eating things that literally didn't exist all that long ago. And a lot of the stuff, I mean, some of the stuff didn't even exist last year. I mean, like these Impossible burgers and things like that. I mean, that's just a chemistry experiment. Yeah. like how can that be good for us?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, whatever
big food will stop at nothing to get for a profit. I heard Sally Fallon of the Weston A. Price Foundation many years ago. She used the term that, this is commodity. What we have today is commodity agriculture. And I really didn't understand what she meant by that. And it took me a long time because I'm a slow learner, but it took me a long time to understand that most of agriculture and of course big food, almost none of it is made to make us healthy. It's made for profit. These are commodities, and they're produced and sold, with one primary goal in mind, and that's to make money. Yeah. It's not about our health. So big food manufacturers they're not interested in our health. And this is another reason. So the vegetable oils cost 6 times less to put in food than butter. So you can buy your 720 calories worth of soybean oil if you're a big food manufacturer for 5.6 cents. 720 calories worth. That's a day's worth of food. I use the term loosely. In the United States, and they're buying it for 5.6 cents, whereas butter would cost them 36 cents for that same amount of calories, about 36 cents. Because this was 2014 data. So are they going to spend 6 times more on butter? No, that's going to cut way into their profit. It's all about profit. And this is why everywhere you look, when you look at processed foods or restaurant foods or fast foods, they're all cooked in vegetable oil. In the United States, it's almost exclusively canola and soybean oil in the restaurant and fast food business.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something. It was a picture that went out from I think it was Goldman Sachs. I believe it was Goldman Sachs. Some sort of meeting that they had there, and on the presentation it said, is curing people's illnesses a sustainable business model? It's just like, or should we perpetuate this disease state and sell them medications chronically for the rest of their life? Is that? And so that sort of made its round, and people were like, okay, well that's bullshit, and it is, but it's like. You were talking about people's lives here and their health and their well-being and that of their children and parents, and yet we're talking about this as if it's a commodity, as if people's health and their lives are commodities, which is truly sick. And I think you've really have a diseased mentality when you start looking at people as commodities and not caring about helping them or just leaving them alone, but actually profiting from their illnesses and selling them things this is just drug dealers. You're selling somebody something that they enjoy and it hurts them, and it hurts them, but you make money, so that's okay. No, it's not okay. That's absolutely horrible. And then profiting off of the treatment of these chronic diseases instead of trying to help them not have the problem in the first place. I just find that despicable.
Yeah. I read a statement from someone. I can't quote who they are, but I can quote the statement. This is from a number of years ago. And they said that there's only one industry in the world that has less concern for its customers than the tobacco industry, and that's big food industry. have less concern about their customers, and it's really pretty true.
Yeah.
You know, that again, their interest is not in our health. Of course, and there's thousands of good organizations in the United States alone that are good, artisan, farmers and, regenerative farmers that are raising animals and raising crops right. And that's where, you can seek those out. Trying to think of the website. I just went blank on it. Eatwild.com. Eatwild.com is a great resource to go and find ancestrally raised foods in the United States. I don't know if it works globally, but it works really well in the United States. So you can find, if you want to find, for example, chicken or pork, or beef that's ancestrally raised, that's near you, Eat Wild is a good source. You can go there and look up. You go to your state, and then you go, then start looking at what's available, perhaps really close to you. So you can even, get to know your farmer or your rancher, the person providing your meat, your milk, eggs, crops, all of that, produce if you want to. Nice. You can do quite a bit of that.
Yeah, fantastic. So great.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. So you've been very generous with your time. I don't want to monopolize more of it, but thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's very, very interesting. Can you tell us where people can find you and where to get your book?
Yes. So again, my name is Chris Knobbe, Knobbe, and we have two nonprofit foundations, Ancestral Health Foundation. And that one does not have a website yet. It's coming in the very near future. It'll be at ancestralhealthfoundation.org. We have another foundation, Cure AMD Foundation. That is present, has been for years. It's cureamd.org. We have Facebook pages for both foundations, Instagram for both foundations, and Twitter for both foundations. I do have a Twitter handle, but I'm not really active on Twitter. Really, I'm sure I should be, but I'm a little resistant to social media.
Good. It's a good. Yeah.
So, but people have found a lot of my work on just on YouTube, a lot of my presentations and podcasts like this. This is the book. I don't know if you can see that there, The Ancestral Diet Revolution. And it is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, almost wherever books are sold online. It won't be in stores, I don't believe, but it's available online. And
wherever he shops.
Yeah, I guess that's primarily it.
Yeah. Perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you very much for being so generous with your time. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Anthony. I really appreciate you having me on your show. It's really an honor and pleasure. Thank you.
Not a problem. And people, please do go out and read the book. It's an absolutely fantastic book. It really does a deep dive into the science and literature. I think there's over 1,300 scientific references on it. So this is a very, very thoroughly researched and well thought out book. So I strongly encourage anyone to take a look at it. So please do. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much for watching. And hopefully you found it interesting. And I will see you guys next time. Hey, guys. Thank you very much for taking the time out to listen to what I had to say. If you like it, then please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel and podcast. And if you're on YouTube, then please hit that little bell and subscribe. And that'll let you know anytime I have a new video out, which should be every week, if not more. And if you could share this with your friends, that would help me get the word out and let me know that you like what I'm doing. Thanks again, guys.